Nathaniel Lancaster stepped into the grand lobby of his new penthouse building, his sharp gaze scanning the polished marble floors and towering glass windows. He didn't have time for distractions. His billion-dollar company demanded his full attention. Moving into this place was supposed to be a fresh start, a rare moment of peace in his otherwise relentless schedule. He had no idea his mysterious next-door neighbor was about to change everything. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, save for the quiet hum of the machinery. When the doors slid open, he stepped out into the sleek hallway, where only 2 penthouses occupied the entire floor, his and whoever lived next door. He barely glanced at the other door as he unlocked his own, stepping inside the luxurious space. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, the furniture was modern yet warm, and every inch of the place exuded wealth. Just as he set his briefcase down, a loud crash erupted from the penthouse next door, followed by a muffled curse. Nathaniel frowned. He wasn't one to pry, but something about the noise made him pause. Against his better judgment, he crossed the hallway and knocked firmly. The door swung open, revealing a woman with wild, dark curls and deep brown eyes filled with frustration. She had a paintbrush clutched in one hand, and a streak of blue paint ran across her cheek. "Can I help you?" she asked, clearly flustered. Nathaniel arched a brow, taking in the scene behind her. Easels, half-finished paintings, scattered brushes. It looked like an artist's studio rather than a luxury penthouse. "I heard a crash," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right?" she sighed, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah, just knocked over a canvas." "No big deal." Nathaniel wasn't convinced. "Are you sure?" The woman hesitated, then huffed. "Fine, I may have also broken a vase. Happy." His lips twitched in amusement. "Not particularly. I don't enjoy the sound of destruction coming from next door." She rolled her eyes. "Well, neighbor, I'll try to keep the destruction to a minimum." Neighbor, the word lingered between them. "You are," he prompted. "Kiera Fontaine," she said, wiping her hand on her oversized paint-stained sweater before offering it. He hesitated before shaking it, surprised by the warmth of her grip. "Nathaniel Lancaster." Her brows lifted slightly. "The Nathaniel Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Enterprises." He was used to recognition, but there was no awe in her voice, just curiosity. "That's me," he confirmed. Kiera studied him, then smirked. "Well, I hope you don't mind a little chaos, Mr. Billionaire. I'm not exactly the quiet type." Nathaniel didn't know why, but he had a feeling his peaceful new home had just become a lot more interesting. Nathaniel didn't usually pay attention to his neighbors, but Kiera was impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, he found himself drawn to the sound of her laughter, the sight of her pacing in the hallway with paint on her hands, the occasional scent of turpentine that drifted through the walls. She was a complete contrast to his carefully controlled life, messy, unpredictable, and utterly captivating. One evening, as he entered the hallway, he nearly collided with her. She was balancing a large canvas in her arms, struggling to keep it steady. "Do you need help?" he asked, already reaching for the frame. Kiera hesitated before nodding. "If you don't mind." He took the weight easily, his strong hands steadying the canvas as he followed her inside. Nathaniel had never seen anything like her penthouse. It was an explosion of color paintings leaned against every available surface, some abstract, others breathtakingly real. The furniture was mismatched, as if she'd collected pieces she loved rather than designing for aesthetics. "Wow," he said, genuinely impressed. Kiera grinned. "Not what you expected." "Not at all," she gestured to the canvas. "That's for a gallery showcase next month if I can actually finish it in time." "Deadlines," he guessed. She groaned. "The worst." For a moment he just watched her, noting the way she talked about her work with so much passion. It was rare to see someone so consumed by what they loved. "You're talented," he said honestly. Kiera blinked. "You haven't even seen my best work." "I don't need to." Something flickered in her gaze, but before he could decipher it, she waved him off. "All right, Mr. CEO, you've done your good deed for the day. Go back to your empire." Nathaniel smirked, but for some reason, he didn't want to leave just yet. Over the next few weeks, their interactions became routine. A shared elevator ride turned into an impromptu conversation. A late-night coffee run ended with them sitting in the lobby, talking about everything and nothing. Nathaniel found himself looking forward to seeing her, despite the chaos she always seemed to bring. One evening, he arrived home to find Kiera sitting outside her door, frowning at her phone. "Locked out," he guessed, she groaned. "The keypad died. I already called maintenance, but they're taking forever." Without thinking, Nathaniel pulled out his key card and swiped it against his own door. "Come in." Kiera hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Unless you prefer the hallway." She rolled her eyes but followed him inside. Nathaniel watched as she wandered through his penthouse, taking in the sleek, minimalistic design. "Your place is very serious," he chuckled, "and yours is very chaotic." "Balance," she teased. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, but for once he ignored it. Instead, he focused on the woman standing in his living room, her presence somehow making the space feel less empty. "Kiera," he said, his voice quieter now. She turned to face him, her expression curious. "Yeah." For a moment, he thought about how easy it would be to step closer to close the space between them. But he wasn't the type to rush. Instead, he smirked. "Try not to break anything while you're here." She threw a cushion at him, laughing. Nathaniel had never let anyone into his life so easily before, but with Kiera Fontaine, it felt inevitable. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind the distraction. Nathaniel had always thrived in precision, in knowing exactly what came next. His life was built on schedules, carefully laid plans, and absolute control. But Kiera Fontaine was none of those things. She was impulsive, unpredictable, and completely undoing everything he thought he knew about himself. It started with small things. The way she would hum to herself in the hallway, lost in thought, as she balanced a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. The way she would text him at odd hours, asking him ridiculous hypothetical questions: would you rather live in a lighthouse or a treehouse? As if she didn't know, he was probably in the middle of a conference call with executives who had no time for whimsy. And perhaps the most dangerous thing of all, the way he started answering. Nathaniel wasn't sure when exactly it became normal for him to stop by her penthouse after work, loosening his tie as she handed him a glass of wine and launched into an impassioned rant about her latest painting. He told himself he was just being neighborly, but deep down, he knew better. One particular evening, as he stepped into her space, he found her standing on her couch, struggling to tack a massive canvas to the wall. "You're going to break your neck," he said, shutting the door behind him. Kiera glanced down, grinning as she held the nail between her teeth. "Not if you're here to catch me," she said around it. He exhaled, setting his briefcase aside before crossing the room. "Move," he said, taking the canvas from her and easily securing it to the wall. She hopped off the couch, brushing her hands together. "I could have done that." "You could have fallen." "Some risks are worth taking," she said, watching him with that unreadable expression she sometimes wore around him. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, arms crossing. And what exactly was the risk? A broken arm? Maybe. Or maybe it was trusting that you'd always be there to catch me. His throat tightened at the weight of her words. She had a way of saying things without saying them directly, of making him feel things he wasn't sure he was ready for. To deflect, he gestured toward the painting. "This is new." She nodded. "It's for a charity auction next month. I don't usually sell my work like this, but the gallery owner practically begged." He studied the piece, the bold strokes of color that somehow felt both chaotic and intentional. "It's incredible." Kiera tilted her head, watching him. "You actually mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean," she rolled her eyes. "God, you are so serious all the time. Someone has to be." "Not when you're with me," she said, nudging him playfully. "You should try relaxing once in a while." Nathaniel didn't think he'd been anything but relaxed lately, at least, compared to his usual self. But there was something about her that made him want to let go, to laugh, to step out of the rigid constraints he had built around himself. And that terrified him. The night of the auction arrived faster than expected, and Nathaniel found himself standing in the grand ballroom of an exclusive gallery, watching Kiera from across the room. She was in her element, effortlessly talking to potential buyers, her dress a deep shade of emerald that made her eyes shine under the warm chandelier light. She caught him watching and made her way over, a glass of champagne in hand. "You clean up well, Lancaster." He adjusted his cufflinks. "I do my best." Kiera took a sip of her drink before saying, "You didn't have to come, you know. I wanted to." Something flickered in her expression, but before she could respond, a sleekly dressed man approached. "Kiera, darling, I need you to meet someone." The man's eyes landed on Nathaniel, recognition sparking instantly. "Mr. Lancaster, I had no idea you and Kiera were acquainted." Nathaniel extended a hand, ever the businessman. "We're neighbors," the man chuckled. "Oh, is that what we're calling it?" Kiera shot him a look. "What do you need, Marco?" Marco, apparently the gallery owner, waved a hand. "Just introducing you to a potential buyer. Your piece is causing quite the stir." Nathaniel watched as Kiera was whisked away, but not before she shot him a glance over her shoulder. He wasn't sure why the sight of her with other men irritated him. It wasn't jealousy, at least, that's what he told himself. Jealousy required ownership, and he had no claim over her. But when, an hour later, he overheard Marco mentioning that Kiera's painting had been purchased anonymously for an exorbitant price, something in him tightened. He excused himself, found her at the bar, and leaned against the counter beside her. "Your painting sold," he said. "I know," she said, swirling the last of her champagne. "It was an insane bid. I don't know who would spend that much." Nathaniel remained silent. Kiera turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Nathaniel." Did you buy my painting?" He took a measured sip of his drink. "It's an investment." She let out a sharp laugh. "Oh my God, you did. You deserve to be recognized for your talent." Her amusement faded slightly as she searched his face. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." Something unspoken passed between them, a shift in the air that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Kiera exhaled, shaking her head. "You really are impossible." Nathaniel reached out, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "And yet, you haven't run away yet." Her breath hitched, and for a brief moment, the bustling gallery around them disappeared. Then, as if sensing the moment was becoming too much, she smirked. "Maybe I like a challenge." Nathaniel chuckled, but deep down, he knew Kiera Fontaine wasn't the challenge. She was the answer to a question he hadn't even realized he was asking. Nathaniel had spent years mastering control, the way he spoke, the way he conducted business, the way he composed himself in every situation. But control was slipping through his fingers like sand, and Kiera Fontaine was the reason why. He hadn't meant for things to escalate. He hadn't intended to buy her painting at the auction, nor had he expected the way her eyes had searched his, looking for something he wasn't sure he could name. But after that night, something shifted. Kiera was everywhere. Not in the literal sense, no, she kept her distance just enough to leave him wanting more. But she was in his thoughts, in the way his steps slowed when he passed her door, in the way his hand hesitated over his phone when he almost called her for no reason at all. And then, she started appearing in places she never had before. It was late, well past midnight, when Nathaniel stepped out of the elevator into the nearly empty lobby of their building. He had just returned from a business dinner, one that had stretched long past his patience. The night was cold, the city streets quiet, and he was ready for nothing but silence. But there she was, sitting at the grand piano tucked away in the corner of the lobby, her fingers poised over the keys. He hadn't known she played. The soft melody drifted through the air, something haunting yet beautiful, something that didn't belong in a marble-floored lobby at this hour. She was focused, lost in the music, her lips slightly parted in concentration. Nathaniel found himself standing there, watching. Eventually, she glanced up, startled to find him there. She pulled her hands back from the keys as if caught in something private. I didn't know you played, he said. Kiera let out a breath, shaking her head. I don't really, not professionally or anything, just when I need to clear my head. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Long night. She gave a quiet laugh, but there was something strained about it. You could say that. Nathaniel had never been the type to pry, but this time he wanted to. Tell me, he said, taking the seat beside her on the piano bench. She hesitated, then exhaled. The gallery wants me to do another showcase. A full solo exhibit. It's a huge opportunity, but I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of pressure. He studied her, noting the way she twisted her fingers together as she spoke. Kiera, who was always so confident, so sure of herself, suddenly looked uncertain. You're more than ready, he said. She turned to him, searching his face. How do you know? Because I've seen your work, and I don't just mean your paintings. I've seen the way you throw yourself into what you love, how you fight for it. That's what makes you ready. Kiera was quiet for a long moment before she let out a soft breath. You make it sound so simple. Sometimes things are. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her expression. Do you ever wish your life was different? Nathaniel considered the question. No, he said honestly, but I do think about how it could be more. That made her pause. More, his gaze didn't waver. More than business meetings and boardrooms, more than strategies and profit margins. She tilted her head. And what does more look like to you? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the piano bench. It was the lightest touch, but it sent something electric through the air between them. Kiera didn't pull away, neither did he. After a long moment, she whispered, we should go upstairs. Nathaniel didn't ask if she meant separately. He knew she didn't. And for the first time in years, he let someone else take the lead. The next morning, Kiera was gone before he woke up. Nathaniel wasn't surprised. She wasn't the type to linger, and he had known from the start that she was unpredictable. But still, when he rolled over to find nothing but empty sheets, something in his chest tightened. He got up, dressed, and headed to the kitchen, only to find a note on the counter in her handwriting. You're right, I'm ready. No signature, no explanation, but he knew exactly what she meant. That night, he went to her penthouse for the first time without an invitation. She opened the door, wearing an oversized sweater, her curls piled on top of her head in a messy knot. She didn't look surprised to see him. You're going to do the exhibit, he said, holding up the note. Kiera crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. I am. And you left without saying anything because, she gave him a small, knowing smile, because I wasn't sure if you'd regret it in the morning. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low. Do I look like a man who regrets anything? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for him, pulling him inside. Nathaniel had never been one to second-guess himself. His decisions were swift, decisive, and final. But as he stood in Kiera's penthouse, the space alive with the scent of paint and something distinctly her, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next move, he was simply present. She leaned against the kitchen counter, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. The usual mischief in her eyes was softened, replaced by something quieter, something more certain. You just let yourself in, she asked, though there was no real challenge in her tone. You left your door open, he countered smoothly. Her lips curved slightly as she pushed off the counter and walked toward him, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. And if I hadn't, Nathaniel reached out, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. I would have waited. Kiera's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. You're not a man who waits for anything. I am when it matters. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, something deep, something vulnerable. And then, as if deciding she had nothing left to lose, she placed her hands against his chest, fingers splaying over the crisp fabric of his dress shirt. What are we doing, Nathaniel? He didn't hesitate. Something that neither of us planned for. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You really don't do well with the unexpected, do you? I'm learning. Kiera studied him for a long moment before sighing. You're going to complicate my life. Good, he said. You've been complicating mine from the moment I met you. Her laughter faded as something more serious settled between them. He could see the walls she had spent years constructing start to lower, and for once, he didn't feel the need to tear them down. He wanted her to let him in willingly. And she did. She lifted onto her toes, her hands sliding up to cup his face as she kissed him, not in the way she had the night before, not with urgency or fleeting passion, but with something deeper, something that demanded permanence. Nathaniel felt the shift, the way everything around them faded, leaving only this moment. He wasn't just falling for her, he had already fallen. Nathaniel wasn't used to waking up to someone else in his bed, but when he opened his eyes the next morning to find Kiera curled against him, her fingers loosely tangled with his, he realized he didn't want it any other way. She was still asleep, her breathing soft, her hair a mess against the pillow. He watched her for a moment, memorizing the way the early morning light cast shadows across her skin, the way her lips parted slightly as she exhaled. Something in his chest tightened. He had never thought of love as something that could sneak up on him. He had always assumed it would come in a way that made sense, that it would be calculated and logical. But Kiera had undone that notion entirely, because there was nothing calculated about this. He had fallen without realizing, without permission, without restraint, and he didn't want to fight it. She stirred slightly, her fingers tightening around his before her eyes fluttered open. It took her a moment to focus on him, but when she did, a slow, sleepy smile spread across her face. "You're staring," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. "I'm allowed," he replied. Kiera pushed herself up onto her elbow, tilting her head as she studied him. "You look different." "How so?" She reached out, tracing her fingers over his jaw. "Less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Nathaniel caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Maybe that's because for the first time I'm not," she exhaled, something uncertain flickering in her expression. "This is real, isn't it?" "It is." Kiera searched his face as if trying to find any sign of hesitation. When she found none, she let out a breath and smiled. "Then I guess we should figure out what comes next." Nathaniel tightened his grip on her hand. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We just have to keep moving forward." She nodded, but he could see the thought forming in her mind before she even spoke it. "I'm in love with you," she whispered. The words hit him harder than he expected, not because they were unexpected, but because he had been waiting for them without realizing it. He reached for her, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched. "Good," he murmured, "because I'm in love with you too." Kiera let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "This is crazy." Nathaniel kissed her, slow and deep. "Then let's be crazy together." And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because as long as Kiera was by his side, he knew that whatever came next, it would be worth it. Nathaniel had never considered himself an impulsive man. Every decision he made was calculated, every move precise. But with Kiera, logic had no place. He didn't question why he wanted her in his life. He simply accepted that he did. Their relationship unfolded in quiet moments between the chaos of their individual worlds. Early mornings, where she stole his coffee before he could take the first sip. Evenings where he would find her painting, utterly lost in her work, and he would just sit nearby, content to watch. But for all the ease between them, Nathaniel knew that Kiera still held a part of herself back. She was reckless in some ways, daring, uninhibited, but when it came to emotions, she was careful. He had seen it in the way she hesitated before saying she loved him, in the way she sometimes changed the subject when he brought up the future. He wasn't a man who accepted uncertainty, and yet with her, he was willing to wait. One evening, he arrived home later than usual, stepping into the hallway just as Kiera was locking her door. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, a small smile curving her lips. "You look exhausted," she noted, studying him. Long hours had never bothered him before, but tonight he felt the weight of them. "It's been a day." She tilted her head, considering him for a moment before reaching for his hand. "Come with me." Nathaniel let her lead him inside her penthouse. The space was dimly lit, and the scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. She pulled him toward the couch, nudging him down before disappearing into the kitchen. A moment later, she returned with a glass of whiskey, handing it to him. He took a sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "You didn't have to do this." Kiera sat beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. "I wanted to." For a moment, they sat in silence. Then she reached out, tracing the cuff of his sleeve with her fingertips. "I know you don't like talking about work when you're home, but do you want to?" Nathaniel considered her offer. He rarely discussed business outside of the office, but with Kiera, it didn't feel like a burden. "There's a merger," he admitted. "It's delicate. If it goes through, it'll be one of the biggest deals I've ever negotiated, but if it fails..." She raised an eyebrow. "Your empire will crumble," he exhaled a quiet laugh. "Not quite. But it will be a significant setback." Kiera was quiet for a moment before saying, "You always act like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You know you're allowed to let someone share the load, right?" Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. "Is that what you're offering?" She held his gaze. Yes. It was such a simple answer, yet it carried more weight than anything else she had ever said to him. He reached for her, pulling her against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time that day, he felt something close to peace. "You're dangerous," he murmured. Kiera laughed softly. "Because I make you feel things. Because you make me want things I never thought I would." She lifted her head, her expression serious. "And what do you want, Nathaniel?" He ran his fingers through her hair, his voice steady. "You..." Her breath caught, and for a moment he thought she might pull away. But then she leaned in, pressing her lips to his, and he knew that no matter what happened next, he wasn't letting her go. Days passed, and then weeks, and before Nathaniel knew it, the lines between their lives blurred. Dinners at his penthouse turned into breakfasts at hers. She started leaving her paint, stained coffee mugs in his kitchen, and he found himself keeping an extra set of his favorite whiskey glasses in her cabinets. It wasn't just a relationship. It was something deeper, emerging of two lives, two worlds that had once been separate but now felt inextricably linked. But for all the ease between them, Nathaniel knew there was still something unspoken lingering in the air. Kiera had never been one for convention, and while she had admitted she loved him, she had never once mentioned the future beyond vague, fleeting moments. And Nathaniel wanted more. One evening, as they sat on his terrace overlooking the city, he reached for her hand. "Kiera," she turned to him, her expression softening at the sound of his voice. "What is it?" Nathaniel wasn't a man who hesitated, but in this moment he wanted to get it right. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said. "I don't want to wake up one day and find you've decided to move on to something else." Her fingers tightened around his. "Nathaniel, I want a life with you," he continued. "Not just stolen moments and late nights. I want all of it," she exhaled, looking away for a moment before meeting his gaze once more. "That sounds a lot like a proposal." He studied her carefully. "Would you say yes if it was?" Kiera was silent, and for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt uncertain. Then slowly she smiled. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" "Never." She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Then yes," his heart pounded. "Yes. Yes, Nathaniel. I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply, and for the first time in his life, he knew he had made the most important decision of all. Kiera Fontaine wasn't just his next-door neighbor, she was his future. Nathaniel had always believed that power came from control, from knowing every move before it was made. But as he stood in the quiet of his penthouse, watching Kiera trace the rim of her wine glass with her fingertip, he realized that love was the one thing he couldn't strategize. She was here in his space, in his life, in his future. And yet, there was a part of him that still couldn't shake the feeling that she might slip through his fingers if he wasn't careful. She had said yes. That should have been enough. But Nathaniel knew Kiera well enough to understand that words came easily to her. Commitment, however, was something she had never truly embraced, so he needed to make this real, unshakable. He set his glass down and reached for her hand. "I want to do this right." She looked up, her dark eyes searching his. Right? I don't want this to be something we stumble into. I want you to know that this isn't just a decision for me, it's a promise. Kiera let out a quiet breath, her fingers tightening around his. Nathaniel, if you're looking for a guarantee, I can't give you one. I've never done this before. I don't know how to be someone's forever. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Neither do I. But I know that I don't want a life without you in it, she swallowed, her expression shifting as something unreadable flickered behind her eyes. So what now? Nathaniel didn't hesitate. We set a date. Her lips parted slightly, caught between surprise and something else. You don't waste time, do you? I never have before, and I'm not about to start now. She studied him, her fingers tracing absent patterns against his wrist. All right, she said finally. Let's set a date. And just like that, it was real. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Nathaniel had ever experienced. His world had always been structured, predictable. But wedding planning with Kiera was the exact opposite. One moment, she was excitedly picking out flowers. The next, she was threatening to elope because who actually needs a seating chart anyway? Nathaniel found himself caught between amusement and exasperation as he watched her navigate the chaos in her own way. But through it all, there was one thing that never wavered: her presence. She was here, she was his. And yet there was still something lingering beneath the surface, something she hadn't said. It wasn't until one evening, when they were curled up on the couch, that she finally spoke the words he had been waiting for. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. Nathaniel turned to face her, his hand resting at the curve of her waist. Of what? She hesitated before exhaling. Of losing myself in this, of waking up one day and realizing that I don't belong in your world. His jaw tightened. Kiera, I know, she interrupted, shaking her head. I know you don't see it that way, but you're Nathaniel Lancaster. You belong to a world of boardrooms and tailored suits and people who have known you since birth. And I'm me. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. You are the only thing in my life that has ever made sense. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to steady herself. What if I mess this up? Nathaniel kissed her, slow and deliberate. Then we figure it out together. And just like that, the last of her hesitation melted away. Because despite everything, despite the doubts and the differences, Kiera Fontaine had never been the kind of woman to run from a challenge. And Nathaniel Lancaster had never been the kind of man to let go of something he wanted. The wedding was nothing like what people would have expected from a man like Nathaniel. There were no grand ballrooms, no extravagant guest lists filled with the city's elite. Instead, they stood in the middle of a sprawling garden, surrounded by only the people who truly mattered. Kiera wore a dress unlike anything traditional, soft fabric that moved with her, as effortless and free as she was. Nathaniel, in his signature tailored suit, had never felt more certain of anything in his life. And when she stood before him, her hands in his, every doubt she had ever voiced disappeared. Because this wasn't about society or expectations or the worlds they came from. This was them. Just them. And when she whispered, I love you, just before saying, I do, Nathaniel knew that no amount of control could have ever led him to something this perfect. Years later, Nathaniel would still find himself watching Kiera the way he had that first night, when she had been nothing more than his unpredictable next-door neighbor. Except now, she wasn't just a fleeting presence in his life. She was his wife, the mother of his children. The woman who had taken his carefully structured world and turned it into something infinitely more colorful. And as he stepped into their home one evening, the scent of paint mixing with the distant sound of laughter, he realized that for all the empires he had built, this life with her was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Kiera glanced up from where she was kneeling beside their daughter, a streak of blue paint on her cheek, and grinned at him. You're staring again, Lancaster. He loosened his tie, stepping forward until he could press a kiss to her forehead. I'm allowed. She rolled her eyes but leaned into him anyway, And just like that, Nathaniel knew this was forever. A love that was never meant to be planned, never meant to be controlled, but one that had, somehow, become the greatest masterpiece of them all.